yeah, in that case, now we'll get started. So yeah, thanks for coming out to QWeb's first tutorial of the year, everybody. Today we're going to be going into tutorial of HTML and CSS. And what we're going to be doing is giving you guys a deep dive into what are really the fundamentals of web development. And these are two technologies that you're going to be using in pretty much any web development project you're coding up in the future. And they're really like the fundamentals, the basics of how to put, text, images, things like that on a screen and start making some super simple but really awesome websites. So before we get started into explaining what these things are and get into the coding project, let's go over text editors. So I sent out an announcement earlier on in the week, making sure that everybody came prepared with a text editor. Is there anybody who does not have a text editor installed and ready to go on their computer? If there is anybody, just let me know in the chat real quick. We're good? Okay, awesome. In that case, we can get started. So the first thing, obviously, that's on our mind is what are HTML and CSS? Some of you guys may have heard them before, some of you guys might have not, but essentially they are, like I said before, the fundamentals of web development. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's kind of a big phrase, not super important to know exactly what those words mean. What's important is that HTML describes the structure and the content of a web page, and it consists of a series of elements that are basically telling the browser what to display on the screen. So the key here with HTML is it's really focused on the what in terms of what is making up the web page we're looking at right now. So if we take a look at the website you guys might remember from the kickoff event, we have this really simple but really good looking personal website created by Jade, one of our education directors on the education team, as well as with some help from me and Bobby. And it's for Rick Astley, a fifth-year music at Queen's University. And what do we have here when it comes to HTML's perspective? So what HTML would tell the browser is that, okay, we have a big heading over here that says Rick Astley. We have a subheading here that says fifth year music at Queen's University. We've got, a paragraph of text. We've got a link to a YouTube channel that goes to a certain URL, and we have an image of Rick Astley himself. So HTML is really focused on what elements are we displaying on the web page and telling that to the browser. If we take a look at the actual code snippet for this website right here, this is the HTML file that is actually involved in displaying the web page we just saw from the kickoff event. So what I'm going to do is that it might seem like a lot to take in at the moment, especially if you're not too familiar with HTML already, but we're going to go through and just touch on some key important points that we want to highlight when looking at this HTML file. So you can see that earlier I mentioned HTML usually consists of a series of elements that are displayed to the screen. And these elements are defined using what we call tags. So when we look at the file here, I'm going to skip over most of this little chunk at the top here because that isn't super relevant to what we want to dive in first. That's more some kind of like metadata and behind the scenes stuff. We're going to look at what's in the body tag here. You can see by it's enclosed by the body kind of in triangular brackets. That's a kind of, we call it an opening tag. And the closing tag has a little slash in front of body. So everything between here, we would call that it's in the body tag. And this is kind of where the content of your website lives. So we can see here the different elements I was talking about. So we can see here we have an H1 tag, which means heading 1, so the biggest kind of heading. We've got Rick Astley. We have a subheading for fifth year music at Queen's University. We have a big paragraph. We have a link here as well, and an image. So you can see, without diving too much into the syntax yet, just by looking at the file and the code itself, HTML is basically telling the browser what is going to be displayed on the screen in terms of what kinds of elements there are: a title, a subheading, a paragraph of text, a link, an image, things like that. Awesome. So that's basically the role of, I think there's a dot I didn't clear out. Nice. So that's basically the role of HTML in a nutshell. So what is CSS? CSS stands for cascading style sheets, and the keyword to zoom in on here is style. So CSS controls the presentation and the layout. So like the aesthetics, anything fancy with like colors or different fonts or different forms of formatting in your website. And CSS files consist of rules that essentially act on the HTML elements we just saw. So if HTML is really concerned with the what, telling the browser, oh, in a web page, there's going to be a title, a subheading, a paragraph, and so on. CSS is about describing what those elements look like and how they're going to present themselves. So you can see that if we go back to our kickoff event website, of course, just knowing that there's a title and what text there is in it, isn't going to be enough for the browser to display the website how we want it. We have to tell it what kind of fonts to use, what kind of sizes we want each of the components to be, what kind of, you can see that this image is cropped as a circle. Originally in our file, you'll see later on that it's a square. So we use CSS to crop it into a circle and tell the element to present itself in a certain way. So that's really what CSS is designed for. If we take a look at the CSS code for the landing page website from the kickoff event, we can see immediately that we're recognizing some of the tags we outlined when we previously looked at our HTML code. So you can see that there's a lot of different kind of, we call them properties here in our CSS code. It's not super important to, like get overwhelmed by them or know, or feel like you have to know rather what they all do right now. But the key thing to zone in on here is that we're telling each element kind of how to present itself. So for example, you could see, in our body, we want to set the font to a certain font. And we want our image to have like a certain height, a certain width. And this line that said border radius here is actually what's turning it into a circle. So CSS is about telling these elements rather how they should be presenting themselves. All right, so recap. HTML and CSS are the fundamentals of web dev. HTML tells us what elements are there, and CSS is telling us how those elements should look. And these are accomplished by HTML describing elements through tags mainly, and CSS describing the presentation through what we call rules. Awesome. So now that we've gone through, basically our intro to knowing what these are all about, let's make a new project. So earlier out in the week, I sent out a file to the announcements that was just called, I believe it was index.html, and it was just some boilerplate code for the website we're going to get started off. Does anybody not have that downloaded and ready to go right now? If you don't, I think you can just scroll up in the announcements really quickly and probably open in your text editor. But we're just going to do like a 30 seconds, 15 seconds to see if anybody's got any problems. Awesome, cool. So if we all have that file open, and what we can do is we can open our folder for our project in our text editor. And you can see I have it open right here. You could also, if you want to make one, if you want to later on make a new HTML project from scratch, what you can do is you can just make a folder for your project, my website, and then open it up, and then create your very own index.html. You can just, start to make a text file and change the extension. And that will give you a pretty much empty web page you can play around with. You can also, if you didn't know, basically just open HTML files in your browser. My file explorer is already configured to load them in Chrome, but if it isn't, I believe you can always just go to open with. And of course, since we just made this, it's an empty file. It doesn't really show anything as a web page. Cool, but yeah, let's go into our code. Awesome. So let's start off with HTML. What you're seeing right now is kind of our jumping off point, and we call this boilerplate for HTML. And if you've never heard of the term boilerplate in kind of programming or software development before, it basically just means that this code is going to be, we're going to want to include this in basically every HTML file as soon as we start. It's going to be there in every project, just because this is kind of the code that lays out the initial structure, which is the same for every HTML file, and tells us that it is an HTML file. So first thing we're going to go into is tags. You can see them already on my screen. And essentially tags, like we talked about, are used to create HTML elements that we see on our web page. And what tags do is they mark up the raw content or like the text that's between them. And the word markup is where the M in HTML comes from. And it basically means we're giving it some raw content, so just some like text we type, and it's telling it that, okay, this text is going to be a title or a paragraph and so forth. So we can see if we start looking into the tags we have, this is basically just the first line telling us that it's an HTML document. The HTML to closing, beginning to closing tag is kind of our biggest spanning tag, just saying, you know, this is our entire HTML web page. And in here, we have our head and our body, which are kind of the two main chunks of our web page. Head is really where a lot of the kind of behind the scenes stuff, where a lot of the metadata for the website goes. So this will be things like, you know, Google Analytics or like search engine optimization, stuff like that, which we aren't going to dive into in this tutorial. We're mainly going to be focusing on the body tag, which is where all of our content goes, our text, our images, stuff we want to show on the screen. When it comes to metadata, there's a lot of different configuration you can do. Right now, we just have kind of one piece that is not even metadata, but it's in our HTML tag, just telling the browser basically that our language is English. But that's just one example I wanted to include in here. There's a bunch of stuff where you could get into, but today we're mostly going to focus on the content. So let's start coding up some basic stuff. So basically the first thing I want to show you guys is just the most basic way of putting text on a screen would be just typing it. So if I want to say hello world, and if I wanted to go to my file explorer, oops, I want to go to my file explorer and just open that up. You would see hello world. So this is kind of what happens if we just type text on the screen, but we can use tags in HTML to mark up the raw content and change it into something more meaningful. So if I want to make it into a heading, I can use the h1 tag and say hello world. And you can see if I refresh the page here, it comes a little different. So earlier on, we said that HTML is responsible for like what the elements are. CSS is responsible for what they look like. HTML does have like a default when it comes to displaying different elements. So it has, you know, by default, H1 will look like, you know, bigger, more bolded. But CSS is more for customization. And of course, we want to do a lot more things than just do what HTML defaults to. So if we want to make a smaller tag, we can use H2. And there's actually available to us in HTML H1 through 6, I believe, which just goes in like smaller kind of emphasis on the heading and subheadings. So those are cool for titles, headings, whatever you want to call them. But what if we want to put some, you know, like just regular chunks of text? We can use P for paragraph. So I could say something like, I'm currently in my and we get to show up like that. So what if we want our text to look a little bit different in our paragraphs? So one thing we can do is we can bold or italicize our text. So we can do that using either the EM or M and I tags for italicized, or the strong and B tags for bold. And these pairs actually do the same thing with each other, italicize or bold the text. But I'm going to go a little bit into why we have different tags for them in a second. But first, let's start off with the most basic kind of way. So if I want to say I'm originally from Toronto, and right now I'm learning, and we want to be all cool and quirky and all like the other text attributes. I'm learning HTML and CSS. We can see that we're going to be italicizing our HTML and bolding our CSS on the web page. So if I change these to the alternative tags, which would be M for emphasized and strong for like, well, strong, rather than I for italics and B for bold, you can see that absolutely nothing changes. That's because they do the same thing by default. So you might be wondering, if they do the exact same thing, why do we have like two of them, and like why would we ever use one or the other? So if we go back to some of our earlier concepts about what the purpose and function of HTML and CSS are, we remember that HTML semantically is about what's there and CSS is about how it looks. So by saying something is bold or italicized, that would really seem like it's more leans towards the sides of CSS's job in terms of presentation, saying it's, looks a certain way. But if we use the tags emphasized and strong, instead of giving the responsibility of how the element looks to CSS, to HTML rather, semantically, and by semantically, I mean just like in the meaning of the word, we're keeping it to HTML is defining what's there. So this text is emphasized and this text is strong. And then later on in our CSS document, we can tell the browser what that means. So we can change it to be something different than italicized or bold. At the end of the day, because HTML defaults to the same presentation style for both use cases, it doesn't really matter in practice too much. But I do want you guys to keep in mind that using emphasized and strong is a practice we'll be adopting over using italics and bold, just because it is more true to the purpose of HTML and CSS. So other than that, we can do a lot more stuff than just put text on the screen. We can put text on the screen, but it's all in a different format. So if I want to make a list, I could use UL for unordered list and LI as list item. So let's say I want to say something like some of my hobbies include, and what are some of my hobbies? I like cooking. I like baking. And I like coding. You guys might also be noticing that the IDE I'm using, my text editor, VS Code, fills in whenever I type like a tag, fills in like the ending tag. That's just like a neat thing it does. You don't need to configure that for your text editor right now. But yeah, if you guys are just wondering, it can be very helpful when developing things, but it's not needed. So now if I open this up, I can see I have a cute little list of some of my hobbies. I can also change this to OL instead of UL for ordered list. And that just means it's going to put kind of 1, 2, 3 and enumerate it rather than it just being bullet points. Awesome. Another thing to point out is that when we're writing text in HTML, if we want to create a new line, just like we would want to hit enter, what it's going to do if I try to save this file is it's actually just going to like pop it back to what it originally was. That's because in HTML, if you want to create a new line, you can't actually just enter in your text editor. HTML won't really understand that. HTML has a tag for new line, which is called break or BR. BR is also what we call a self-closing tag. Or I believe it might also be called a void tag, which means that there's no like content to put in between it. So you can either write it as BR like this or BR with like the slash at the end. It doesn't really matter. Both are valid, but my IDE saves it to the latter anyways. So what this is going to do is add a new line character for us. Okay, last tag we're going to go into for now is actually, I'm going to save that one. These are all the tags we're going to go into for now. There are a ton of tags in HTML because there are so many different things you can put in a website. I want to emphasize that you guys definitely do not have to know or like memorize all of these tags. There's way more than this. And at the end of the day, if you're making a website, you want to figure out, oh, how do I put like a table in? Is there an HTML tag for this? You can just Google it. It's not like, we're like it's not like it's a course where you have to write an exam or anything. And we will be giving you guys references to learn about more HTML tags and CSS properties at the end of the tutorial. But this was basically just a primer to get you guys to know how to use any kind of tag and nail down the concepts of how to build things step by step when it comes to the content in your HTML page. That being said, there are a few more tags I want to touch on for you guys. I'm going to add a new paragraph here and say, maybe in my personal site, I want my visitors to check out my YouTube channel. And what if I want to have a link to my YouTube channel? I can use the A tag, which stands for anchor. And anchor tag is used mainly for links and such and stuff of that nature. But if I just include it like that and refresh my page, you can see that there's no, hyperlink like I wanted. It doesn't really do anything because how could it do something? It doesn't know where to link to. And that leads us into attributes. So attributes add meaning or extra information to the element it's attached to in HTML. For example, the URL I want my hyperlink to redirect to. Sometimes they're optional. So in our H1 or H2 or paragraph, since it's just dealing with text, we don't really need to include any attributes. There are attributes that we could include for many elements, but not all of them are necessary. And again, there are tons and tons of them, so we're not going to go through all of them. But some of them pretty much do need attributes, or else they won't really function like we want to, like the A tag. So to add an attribute, we can pretty much just write it in the triangular brackets and declare its value. So I want the href, which is just like the URL it's going to redirect to for my link, to be, let's just say youtube.com. And once we do this, we can see we get a link and it's going to go to YouTube. Awesome. Cool, so we went over href. Another thing we might want to do on our website is include some pictures, not just plain old text. So this is another example of a case where we have a lot of attributes to play around with, because with an image, we need to know where to grab the image from, how big is it, how the width and height of the image size, and so forth. So if I just do image like that, again, it's not going to do anything. But let's say I want to pull I don't know, I want to pull an image from the internet. Somebody just type a random word in the chat and I'm going to Google it. Dog. All right, we're gonna take a random picture of a dog and say that's me. I like this guy. I kind of like this guy. Let's do this guy. Actually, this is a huge photo. Maybe we don't want this guy. Maybe we want something a little bit smaller, just so that we don't have to repurpose it right away. This is not that big. I can actually just get the link. Wow, did we get 2 Shreks? Oh my god. So if I want to click source or type source, that is a long ass URL, but we're going to stick with it for now. This can be, any length of URL pretty much. Okay, so now we've defined the source for our image. And if we reload our page, we can see that it doesn't work. Why is that? Maybe the link's broken or something. I don't know. You know what? Let me try that again. Maybe this dog doesn't like me. Maybe that's why. Let's try this dog. And what if I copy the link directly? Nope. What if I copy the link directly from here? Let's see here. Boop. Image source equals that. Okay, let's give this a try. Awesome. I guess the other link was just broken or something. That dog didn't like me, I guess. But yeah, so now we have an image on our website. And we can see that it's of this lovely, lovely dog here. I guess this dog is now Brandon, in his 3rd year of computing at Queen's. Very smart dog. Also, when you guys are following along, or if you guys are following along with the tutorial, feel free to just write down whatever you want. You don't have to say you're Brandon. It can be your own personal portfolio. It can be whatever topic you want to write about. Or if you, feel like you're kind of person who learns best just by, watching attentively and not having to code along with me, feel free to do that now. Feel free to do that as well, rather, because we're really just, driving home that people learn in different ways, and we want to keep our tutorials, our curriculum kind of flexible so you guys can adopt any kind of learning strategy you want. So if you like cats, if you like, I don't know, apples, that's your favorite thing, do it up. If you like Shrek. Cool. So we have our source as our URL. And then we can see that, we love dogs. This dog is amazing. But the image we have on our website is, pretty large. It's just the default resolution that we downloaded it from, or rather linked to it from. So we can define the width using an attribute called width. So let's say we want our dog to be 300 pixels. And there we go. One thing to note is that if you're using width attribute with the image tag, it will keep the aspect ratio if you only include one of width and height, but not the other. But you can also override that by, let's say, let's say I want a wide dog. Or a tall dog rather, I can do something like this. So yeah, but if you leave it undefined, it will just keep the regular aspect ratio. There we go. So different elements can share or allow different attributes. Some of them have ones that are only exclusive to them pretty much. So for example, in our paragraph tag, wouldn't it really make sense to put a source attribute because, why do we need that? We don't need to link to anything or get anything from a website. But for example, one attribute that we can apply to multiple elements would be title. So what title does is, if we add the attribute and refresh our page and hover over the image, it'll give us a little caption there. And we can do the same thing actually to our H1 if we wanted to, and pretty much any element I can think of as well. Cool. Awesome. So that's a lot of the basic tags and concepts surrounding HTML. And we have a pretty cool website going on here. We got, an intro, we got a list, we got some external links, but it still really doesn't look like something as clean or as polished as Rick Astley's website. So what are we going to do about that? We're going to learn some CSS. So there are a few different ways we can add styles to our website. And I'm going to go through them one by one and tell you guys about what is the kind of most commonly used and most preferred for organization's sakes. But first, we're going to start with inline because it's the best introduction to how we use styles. So this relates to just what we just learned about attributes, in that we can use an attribute called style to apply a unique style for a single element. So let's say we wanted our H1 to be the color blue. And be centered on the page. In order to do that, we'd use the style attribute, and the syntax that's right in here is something we'll dive into a little bit more when we go into the other types of styling, just because it's kind of cluttered and hard to see at the moment, especially when you add a lot of different, we call them properties like color. But all it's saying is that property color, set it to blue, property text align, set the value to center. So if we refresh our page, our title is blue and centered. So this works. If you are doing this in a real web development project, you want to use this very sparingly because it would be very, very cumbersome to kind of apply this for every element you want to style. But it can be good if you just want to do one thing specifically that's really short and unique for a single element. Note that if I make another H1, this will not apply because it only applies, let's say hi again. It only applies to the element whose tag we put it in. So it only affects this H1 up here. Awesome. So there's got to be a better way. This is where we bring in the concept of style sheets, where cascading style sheets comes in. So if we, instead of using the style attribute, we use the style tag in HTML, and we use that in our head section because it's not really something that's directly being displayed to the screen in our content. It's more of like a thing, a metadata that we reference in our web page with some information. If we use the style tag and we specify what we call a CSS rule, like we talked about earlier, we could do something like H1, color, blue, and text align, center. And I'm just going to delete this to show you that it works. And there we go. And we can adjust this just as we would use, or just as would we adjust our style attribute. So we can change it to red. There are a bunch of different properties with a bunch of different details, but for colors, we could also use like a hex code if you wanted, but you can even do, I'm pretty sure even if I put like some weird colors like magenta, it might recognize it. Maybe? Oh, it will, that's awesome. So cool. This is another way of styling CSS, and this brings us to kind of a better organizational state because now we can apply or use styles for the entire HTML document that are defined up top. And I would like to note that also all three of these styling methods I'm going to show you can be combined. So if I wanted, my H2 to be, use the style attribute here to make it like blue, I could do that as well. So they can be combined and used with each other. If you're targeting the same kind of element, let's say I applied an H1 here and I also applied a style to H1 here, there are a few different rules as to which styling takes precedence that we're going to dive into later. So this is cool. It's a lot better. We can apply a style sheet for an entire HTML page, but there is an even better way to do this. And this is, I'm going to skip over that for now. This is external CSS, and probably the most common way you will see web developers organize styling in their projects, and is probably the best when it comes to organization, and also especially with projects that have multiple files and are very, very big. So what we want to do to use external CSS is create a new CSS file. So we're going to create a new file called index.css. When it comes to naming, you can name the CSS file the same name as your HTML file if you want to keep them kind of paired up like that. Some people also might name this styles.css, but it doesn't matter too much. I'm going to stick with index.css for simplicity's sake right now. And what we can do is we can declare a rule in our index.css. So we can do the same thing basically. I'm actually just going to copy it from here. We can do the exact same thing that we said in our internal style sheet, but except here we have it as an external style sheet. So it's just in a different file. And you're going to notice that if I do this and refresh the page, it's not working because we haven't linked the CSS style sheet to the HTML document yet. So what we're going to do, I just saw a question in the chat. Yes, these slides will be posted. What we're going to do is we're going to use the link tag and use the attribute rel as set it the value to style sheet, and use the href tag to link it to whatever style sheet we want. And if we do that and refresh, it's going to work. Cool. So let me just clean up our CSS real quick here rather. And now we've been introduced to external styling with external style sheets in CSS rather. Cool. So we're about halfway done the tutorial, or actually we're probably close to the halfway, but it's about halfway through the time, 6:40 right now. So I want to take a quick break and just give you guys time to catch up if you need to, reference any code or bugs you're having right now, and also give you guys a chance to ask any questions. Me and my education directors will be able to help you guys out with anything you're kind of confused on, anything you want more clarification on. And if there's no questions, then we're just going to take a little bit of a break. So yeah, these slides, I'll post them after the session as well and also upload the recording. Yep, here's the CSS file. So we've got a simple rule here. It's just applied to every H1 element in our HTML document, set the color to magenta and the text align to center. Also, if you guys have any questions after the tutorial, feel free to ask them in the coding questions. Yes, the coding questions channel in the QWeb Discord server, and the education team will be able to help you guys out. Cool. If it seems like we're all good to go, then let's keep on going. All right, so we learned about external CSS. Now let's go back one slide and talk about how we actually write CSS. So if we look here, this image I actually took from a website called Interneting is Hard. They do a really, really good HTML and CSS tutorial that's very thorough in like a written format, or I guess not strictly written, but in like a, just like in a website with a lot of like images and steps and such like that. And that was personally my favorite HTML and CSS tutorial I've ever done. Like I had known bits and pieces of it, but then I came to this tutorial and it was actually recommended to me by my team lead when I was in QWeb in first year, and kind of like relearned all the fundamentals, and I thought it was really, really awesome. So definitely suggest that. But this is a short example of what a rule looks like in CSS. So a rule is made up of 3 components. We have a selector, which is the element or tag it's targeting in this case. So this means in our example that this CSS rule will be applied to all H1s in our HTML web page. We have our property, which is just the thing it's altering, and the value. So for example, it's setting the color to a hex code or setting the color to magenta. And CSS is composed of a bunch of these rules to act on whatever is selected. So how do we select things? There are a bunch of different ways to select things in CSS so we can apply a style to them. The one we've been using right now has been called, or is called rather, an element selector. And what this does is we specify it using the tag name, and it will style every element that has that tag in our HTML document. So for H1, it's going to style every H1. If we add another one, let's say something like this, hi again. This will also be in magenta and be centered. There are a few different ways to select elements in HTML to be styled by CSS. One thing we can do is use an ID selector. So in order to give an HTML element an ID, we add the ID attribute and just give it a ID. So any kind of unique word or phrase that can identify it. So maybe it's something like, I don't know. This is the hardest part of web development, thinking of random arbitrary words. Let's shoot hi again. And in order to use an ID selector, we start off with a hashtag in our CSS rule, and we'll put hi again. And let's see, maybe we want this to be a bit bigger. So we can have it as like 30 pixels or something like that. Well, that wasn't really that much of a difference. Let's do like 300 pixels, why not? Hello. All right. We're gonna do an easier to read example. Let's do a color. Someone say any color in chat. Any color, and we'll try to find the best one in CSS if it matches. Okay, green. No, do gold. All right. I respect your decisions. Oh, we do have gold. Nice. So yeah. And you'll see that I inadvertently did an example of overriding CSS, and I'll explain the rules for that in a bit. But for now, we're just going to go through the selectors. So when it comes to ID selectors, IDs are used to uniquely identify a specific element. So this is really good if you want to single out a single specific block or element of your web page that you want to apply a style to. And that is when you'd use an ID selector. Element selectors would affect every element that they specify. There is one very, very powerful selector in CSS called class selectors. And in order to explain that, I'm going to tell you guys about classes and also divs in HTML. So first off, let's talk about divs. So going back to a bunch of tags we learned, the div tag is a very, very powerful tag in HTML, and you'll use it a lot when you get into more complicated websites. Use the div tag to define a section or a chunk or a block of content in an HTML file. So if we wanted to say separate our content, maybe it's like everything, the text up here from, our image and our like socials right here. What we could do is we could use a div tag and surround our content, and then do the same with another div for our image and link. Whoop, I should start it up here actually. Check out my YouTube channel. Let's close the div here and open it here as well. Okay, cool. So if we go back and we refresh the page, nothing happened. That's because by default, divs don't really do that much on their own. They're more for sectioning off code, and we can do things with divs later to perhaps target a certain chunk of our code. For example, one thing we can do is we can give our divs a class, and a class is basically just like a name for this section of code, or maybe even you might use a class name multiple times throughout your HTML document because maybe you have multiple content blocks or multiple social media links and you want to do similar things to them. So let's call this div content. Let's call this div, let's call it footer. It's not really a footer. Let's do socials. Our socials will have a big image in it, but that's okay. And by defining classes in our divs, we can then use a class selector in our CSS file to apply CSS to this entire chunk or this entire chunk, as well as if we were to define another div that had class equals content, it would also apply to that section as well. Classes are, I would say, most commonly used with divs, but you can apply a class name to basically any type of element. So let's say if we wanted to target the whole body of our web page, we just say class page. If we wanted to do something like, class equals name on our H2, we could do that as well. And again, right now, our classes haven't really done anything, but they will in a sec when we use our class selectors. So to use a class selector, we're going to start with a period, and then we're going to do our class name. And so now everything or every style we define in this rule is going to be applied to the entire content block. So let's say we want to change the font. We can do Arial instead of the default Times New Roman. And you'll see that the text changed for this up here, but not for this down here. Let's say for our title, we want to do something like, I don't know, change the font again. Did I call this title? No, I called it name. Let's say my name wants to be cool and quirky. And we're going to go with, I don't even know what half these things are. Verdana? That sounds cool. Nice. All right, awesome. So you can see how we can use class selectors to apply styles to chunks of code. Awesome. So now we're going to talk a little bit about CSS rules. I should have changed the name of this part because I don't want you guys to confuse it. This is like a CSS rule, but these are like rules as in like laws, for lack of a better term, about how CSS applies. So the first one is order. You might be wondering, okay, we have an H1 rule here. What if I add another one and say, color is like aquamarine or something like that? What's going to happen? In CSS, the most recently defined rule will take precedence. So because this is, more recently defined in our file than the one up here, it's going to change to aquamarine. It will only change if it's like overriding a property that's already there. So for example, you see that even though we didn't define text align in this one, the text align was defined in the earlier one, and that stays the same. The next one is specificity. So in CSS, some selectors or methods of selection are going to be more specific than others and take precedence regardless of the order. So for example, if on our H1, we added an ID called title, and then we put, let's say, a ID selector for title up here, and we change the color to red, it would turn into red. Even though these selectors, or these rules rather, are more recently defined, the ID selector has a higher specificity than the H1 selector. So therefore, or rather I should rephrase that, the ID selector has more precedence than the element selector. So therefore, this style will be applied. And then next up, our last CSS rule we're going to talk about inheritance. I'm actually already a little bit talked about this in our H1 example. Basically what inheritance means is that styles will be inherited from their parents if they are not directly redefined. So that's where the cascading in cascading style sheets comes in. So for example, in here, we can see that in our, let's say our content div, let's go to content. Even though in our paragraph, we have not directly defined any kind of rule or style for the font family, since our paragraph is in our content div, it will take on that font. Awesome. So to recap, HTML chiefly for content and markup, CSS chiefly for style and presentation. This is the semantic way of thinking what the purpose of each of these technologies is. And if you need an example of this, you can always think back to the argument where we want to be using the strong and emphasized tags in HTML rather than the bold and italics tags for the reason of driving home the purpose of HTML on CSS. So I think we only have around like 5-ish minutes left for the tutorial. So I might try to, I think I'll skip this for now. It's not really too important. All you need to know is that in CSS rather, there are a few different measurements. So instead, if I wanted my, let's say in my, I said I'm going to skip it, but now I'm explaining it. Go Brandon. So if I had my content be 50 pixels, wow, that is disgusting. Let's say I want it to be 50 pixels. We can also put different kinds of measurements here. So one way we can do things is we can scale the size of anything based on the font size of our web page. So if we put a body rule here and said, body in our font size is 14, and then for this font size, we put 2EM, it would do 2 times 14. So EM is a measurement that scales on inherited font size. And another one is VH and VW, which is, this should be switched, viewport height and width respectively. And what that means is it scales to 1%, or each unit of VH or VW is 1% of the container's width or height. So for example, I hope this will work. Let's make sure. If I set the width of my content block to be 100, that just means that it's always going to be take up the full screen or width of the screen. And then in my P tag, I set the font size to say like 10 BW. Let's see if this works. So you can see that if I resize my screen, it's going to increase the size of the font because it's dependent on how wide its container is, which in this case is the entire window. All right, cool. I'm going to quickly go into dev tools. So let's not do this because that is very hard to look at. If you're in Chrome, I'm actually not too experienced with other browsers, but if you hit F12, you're going to see this little sidebar pop up, And this is the same kind of sidebar if you were ever like a really cool hacker kid in middle school and you like clicked inspect element and you like knew how to do all that stuff and you were like really cool. It's the same kind of deal. What it is it's Chrome's own kind of development tools for debugging and testing HTML and CSS in our purposes in the browser. So if we wanted to just like make a quick change, see how something looks, we could change our image to like 500 pixels and it would update immediately. When we do something in the browser dev tools, it does not change in our code. So you can see like here, our width is, still 300 pixels. And if I reload the page, it changes back. But this is great for just like testing small changes on the fly. Okay, that brings us to the end of most of the tutorial content itself. So I'm going to take a break right here. Does anybody have any like questions about anything we just talked about? Any bugs? Education directors, if you think there's anything I didn't mention or forgot to cover, feel free to, just like unmute and teach something to our members as well. But yeah, it's going to give you guys a minute to see if there's anything you want to ask. I don't know why that other dog link didn't work. That's interesting. When I was making this tutorial, I also like for myself, like the code, I did it about like as if it was my personal portfolio, and I like had different kind of like styling for the title and picture of me. And it ended up being like green and like brown and like aligned to the left, and it looked very, very ugly. This is actually a much better website than what I prepared for the tutorial that we made on the fly. So good choice on the Daniel and Marion for the gold color. I like it. Plays well with the red that I chose on the fly. Awesome. Which link do you copy for the pictures? That is a great question. So if you want to, this is actually something I missed. So thank you for bringing this up. So let's say I just want to pull a random image from the internet. It could be something I like Googled. So like, I don't know, Dogecoin. I would just go to Google Images, whatever image I want. Let's say I want this one. If I just like click on like the image, it might bring me to like the website, which I don't want. What you can do is you can right click and hit open image in new tab and copy this link over here. Or I believe you can do, is copy image address the same? I think it is. So if we were to do this and change the source, that would work as well. Awesome. This also reminds me, thank you for bringing this up, because you can also add images that are just stored locally. So if we don't want to drop from our website, what we can do is my mouse is not dragging this. Interesting. Huh. Well, there we go. Yeah, if I drag this into, can I just drag into VS Code? Awesome. If I drag it into my project folder and then just use a relative link, this is what we call an absolute link, the one to the URL, because it just like points to a certain direction on the web. We use an absolute link, or a relative link rather. Sorry if that was confusing, but this is a relative link. It just is relative to where this HTML file is. If we made a new folder called image and put it in there as well, we could do image/PFP. And we can load files locally as well too. Thank you for that question, actually very helpful. Awesome, and if there's nothing else to go over, it is 7 o'clock, but I'm going to quickly go over the post tutorial for this. So we will be sending out the mini project and the further references and resources for the tutorial right after tonight. But for your mini project for this tutorial, what I want you guys to do is create your own simple portfolio website. We've already done, a pretty cool website right here with a lot of different elements together. But I want you guys to use the link provided to the landing page kickoff website, as well as the different resources we're going to give to you guys for HTML and CSS syntax, and make your own thing. So like make it about you, Doesn't even have to be about like, it can be about your dog if you want. Anything that's just, a website that's like showcasing something and uses a lot of the aspects that we just learned about. So speaking of those resources, a few things I want to mention. I already talked about interneting is hard, really cool CSS and HTML tutorial. It's pretty thorough. This tutorial is essentially like a very condensed version of some of the first few chapters of it. So would definitely recommend looking at it if you are wanting to do like a thorough, well, not like overly deep, but like a pretty comprehensive, like text-based, like chapter style tutorial of HTML and CSS. And we're also going to link you guys to W3 Schools, which is a great reference for HTML and CSS syntax, as well as Mozilla, which is the company that developed Firefox. They have a great table of like a bunch of different HTML tags and CSS properties. There are tons. Please don't feel pressure to know all of them or know how to use all of them. I don't know most of these. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for coming. But yeah, that is about it for intro to HTML and CSS. So thanks everybody for coming out to the tutorial today. We will keep you guys posted with these resources rather, as well as the mini project. And also look out for the education groups, which is going to be small group chats with just like a few people in the club, where if you guys are working on your mini project and are stuck on something, you can just ask like, hey, anybody figured this out? Anybody have any ideas for this? And those will be coming out soon as well. So thanks for coming, everybody.